Hello, everybody. It's Friday, September the 12th, 2025. This conversation will actually go out tomorrow on the 13th. But of course, the news today is dominated by the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It seems, at least at this point, on Friday the 12th, that the assassin has been caught and taken into custody. And there's a certain amount, at least according to the New York Times, known about him, including what he wrote on the bullet casing of the bullets he used to assassinate Kirk. A lot of the messages are ironic, using web language, all sorts of other trolling language, which of course is particularly troubling. This seems to be, at least today, an assassination from the left. My guest today, though, I think is an expert on violence from the right. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is one of America's leading experts on extremism, particularly from the right. Her new book is called Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. Of course, this was written well before the assassination of Charlie Kirk. Cynthia, congratulations on the new book. It's a rather dark moment in American history.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah.
What does your book tell us about the violence on the left? You focus mostly on the rise of violent extremism on the right, but do you see these two phenomena connected in any way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so first of all, thanks for having me. It's great to be back, Andrew. And the book, I would say, touches more on the kinds of misogyny that underpins in a documented way violence from Islamist groups and from the right, where we have in general seen more parallels, ideologically speaking, in terms of the goals, right? Civilizational ethno-states and restoration narratives, utopian ideals about territory, and the use of misogyny and the exploitation of women and girls and boys, from the Yazidi women to the Nigerian schoolgirls, etc., and the same kinds of things happening among neo-Nazis running prostitution rings who've been arrested, for example. So that's really it's really that side of terrorism that I address in the book and extremism in the book. But separately, in the lab that I run, we do have work on left-wing extremism, on anti-Semitism from the left in particular. And we have a gendered violence portfolio that looks at non-ideologically at the role of gender-based violence as it mobilizes different forms of violent extremism and extremism in general. So I can say on the left and the right, there's definitely, I mean, we're seeing upticks in both. We still have, we have in general the biggest amount of political violence right now that we've had since the 1970s. We've also had surges on the hate-fueled violence side, and sometimes those intersect. And so we don't know enough yet about the shooter in the Kirk case, although we know a little bit about how he grew up, but we don't know, and we know about what was written on the shell casings, but there's so much ironic gaming, language there that it's really hard to say whether those reflect his beliefs or they're being used to troll authorities. And I think a lot more has to come out of the investigation and the interviews and analysis of things that he may have written or published online for us to really know a lot more about that motivation. But I will say that when you look at something like the United Healthcare CEO's assassination or other violence,
and that was, of course, Luigi Mangione, and according to the Rolling Stone magazine, he's been celebrated as a folk hero. He was, of course, he assassinated Brian Thompson in December of last year in New York. It was again a clear assassination.
Absolutely. And I think that, that celebration of the assassination has been echoed in the last 24, 36 hours now since Kirk's assassination on social media, not among political leaders, luckily, who I think really have, for the most part, taken a pretty unified stance against political violence and have
except
condemned.
Who, we won't mention his name, but he,
we, as I said, almost everybody, right? But it's been a pretty strong nonpartisan response to, for the most part. I mean, there was some partisan backlash initially, but I think that there's been a lot of condemnation from the left, from the right, on the use of political violence in this way, and certainly on an assassination. But online, you are seeing a lot of like, you reap what you sow kind of language that's really troubling. And that's where I think, in much more upstream way, not at the violent end of the spectrum, but at the kind of cultural norms that are shifting in terms of acceptance of political violence and willingness to engage in it, where we have seen big increases both on the left and the right in recent years. That's super troubling. And that does relate back to my book, because one of the top 3 predictors of support for political violence and willingness to engage in it right now is misogyny, or hostile sexism, depending on how the researchers define it. So, there are connections among all of these things, and that's across 7 countries. It's not just in the US. The data is really clear. So I think one of the things that we're seeing is a huge uptick, and again, not the Kirk assassination necessarily, but we're seeing a big uptick in sort of wars about the culture wars, right? Cultural war issues, social issues, including gender, right? Reproductive rights, transgender issues, LGBTQ issues, fueling this sense of us versus them mentality and the positioning of the other as an existential threat, whether that means celebrating when one of them is the other, supposedly other side is taken out, or feeling like it's a legitimate thing to attack a couple of Congress people in Minnesota, for example, because of their positions on reproductive rights, or target Planned Parenthood clinics. I mean, we're really seeing a lot of that on the right and the left, and a lot of it is rooted in gender, although, of course, not all of it.
We will come to Man Up in 1 second. One more question, though, that is related to the Kirk assassination. There was a very interesting piece today in the Wall Street Journal on the generational quality of political violence, written by Kevin Walston. I'm not sure if you know him, but and he uses these statistics. I assume they're correct, that 93% of baby boomers believe that it's never acceptable to use violence in politics, whereas 58% of Generation Z believe it is. Is there a generational quality to this beyond left and right?
There's a huge generational quality to this. I think, we started seeing 4 or 5 years ago in our work on higher ed campuses, professors telling us they were hearing things from students, both on the left and the right, like there is no political solution, right? Whether that's about climate change or about immigration or whatever, that's a call to violence. That's basically saying they give up on politics, and violent mobilization is the only way to get change to happen around the issues that you care about. I think there's 2 sets of problems there. One is the, desensitization to violence, and the sort of view that, that these others are really such a threat that we do have to take violent action against it. That's that us versus them mentality that I was talking about. But the other is that they honestly haven't seen very effective political solutions to these kinds of issues, and certainly not bipartisan ones or collaboration from the grown-ups in the room.
Let me jump in here, Cynthia. I'm not accusing you, of course, of anything, but I wonder whether that kind of language could be seen as dangerous. Politics is never the most effective theaters. I mean, any time in history, there's always been complaints about the dysfunctionality, the corruption of political institutions and ideas. Should we be careful to suggest that nothing political works, therefore violence becomes the logical answer?
100%. I mean, I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm saying that's what we're hearing from a younger generation. And so that is, I think, where it's coming from, and what we as, the adults in the room, I mean, I'm not Gen Z, are adults already, many of them, but as the older generation of leaders, of political leaders, of analysts, of scholars, have to make sure that it's clearer to them why violence is not a solution. I think so I would never advocate for violence. I've consistently advocated nonviolent solutions my whole life, but I hear it from students, and we hear it in focus groups from students, that they feel across the spectrum, not all of them, but increasingly a much bigger percentage, as you see in that data, than in the older generation, that it's the other things haven't worked. So why wouldn't we resort to violence? They feel it's legitimate in some way. And that, I think, is a huge cultural failing of our the democratic state we're in if more than half of Gen Z now think that's okay.
You were on the show back in October of 2020 about how the far right is weaponizing youth culture. Back then, you'd just come out with your book, Hate in the Homeland, the new global far right. You also have a book called The Extreme Gone Mainstream. What's your take on Charlie Kirk? I mean, he was enormously effective at Turning Point USA. Might they be seen as an example of how the far right is weaponizing? And I use that word carefully. I don't mean it necessarily militarizing youth culture.
Yeah. Charlie Kirk was an extremely effective mobilizer of youth around issues that many people on college campuses in particular and across the left found abhorrent, right? So he was an effective mobilizer of cultural divides, right? And I think you could see that. Did he himself weaponize youth culture in the way that I talk about in the book? It's not quite what I mean there. There I am talking more about the kind of ironic, the use of humor and satire, the jokes, the memes, the use of iconography that makes fun of, everything and declares then everything is just deniable as just a joke, right? There's always plausible deniability.
The hatification, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's a slightly different, from what I know about Kirk, that's a slightly different thing. He made very strong stances that, were offensive to a lot of people. But I don't think he was quite the one in the scenes in terms of where far right youth or conservative youth were mobilizing or interested, who was doing that kind of weaponization. He was a little bit more of a straight shooter in terms of being he's not a meme generator. He's a debater.
It was an interesting podcast I listened to actually yesterday to prepare for this conversation on the London Review of Books with Emily Witt on the Manosphere. She was reviewing a couple of other books that are included. She wasn't reviewing your book, but I'm sure she's read it in a similar vein. When it comes to Kirk and his critique, perhaps one might say intolerance of certain cultural norms, or perhaps from his point of view, they weren't norms. What exactly does misogyny mean? I mean, if for somebody like Kirk, and this came out in the conversation with Emily Witt, although I think it took place before the Kirk assassination, is a reliance on traditional wives or a faith in traditional wives, is that a form of misogyny? What does this word even mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I use misogyny in not as hatred of women, which is often the popular definition of it, but I use it in its more expansive form that Kate Mann, the philosopher, has defined, which is the law enforcement arm of the patriarchy. So it's a policing of gendered norms and expectations that support patriarchal, unequal distribution of power, essentially. So it's not that traditional marriages or traditional roles, there's anything wrong with them if people choose them, right? It is, but it's when people are policed for not choosing them with misogynistic rhetoric, hateful words, with demeaning, belittling language, or with rape threats or sexual assault threats, right? To say, get back in your place, get back in the kitchen, get back in the closet to LGBTQ people. That's when it becomes misogyny, if that makes sense. It's a gender policing. So people have the right to choose whatever they want. And traditional, you can choose to adhere to a submissive role as a traditional wife in the trad wife sense of submission, or you can, espouse traditional norms, and you can say anything you want about gender roles in that sense. But when you're policing the behaviors of others, that's when it becomes misogynistic, because you wanted to adhere to a set of traditional norms and expectations.
So it's the Handmaid's Tale-ification.
Yeah.
What do you make then, Cynthia, of the trad wife phenomenon, the success of Kirk, and of Turning Point action on campuses? Some of the conversations I've heard since the assassination have suggested that he has become the counterculture, and the trad wife narrative or discourse, whatever word you want, is really the equivalent of the counterculture of the 60s, which might, in a sense, mainstream misogyny. There might even be some people that would argue that misogyny is the new counterculture.
Yeah, super interesting. I mean, I think there's some truth to that. I think that there is some certainly misogyny or forms of gender-based bigotry, like, having a million people reshare, white supremacist chant after the election that says "Your body, my choice," right? Some of that kind of stuff, the celebrations of the loss of women's reproductive rights that happened online, right? Those kinds of things. To see that go quickly and spread quickly, and to have people tell me, as they hear me talk about it, what happened to their kids in school. A 12-year-old girl told to go put on her handmaid's dress, or an 18-year-old young woman had her butt grabbed at a coffee shop, a daughter of a colleague of mine. And when she turned around to look at the guy, he said, "We can do that now," right? All of those are things that were kind of unimaginable 5 or 10 years ago.
So what did she do in response to that?
She didn't know what to do. But what's interesting is another group of guys spoke up and told the guy that wasn't cool. So somebody else overheard it, a group of other guys at the coffee shop, and said, "Hey, man, that's not cool."
It's beyond cool. I mean, it's the kind of thing that might send you to jail. It's a crime.
Yeah, right, exactly. But there's this sort of sense of empowerment over women's bodies that came as a result of these, in that moment. Not from everyone, of course. And this is the other point of the book, is like, I really try very hard to make sure. I did a lot of outreach to the men's wellness community, and the book launch in New York was with Mark Green, who's part of the Good Men Project, really trying to challenge some of these ideas that this is a problem that only women have to deal with, right? So I by no means want to say it's all men, or demonize men for this. I think that we're in a cultural moment of retrenchment and backlash against some gendered social changes that has also opened up avenues for scapegoating and blame, and some more blatant misogyny that has not become totally mainstream, but has certainly moved the Overton window to normalize some of it.
We did a show a couple of years ago with Richard Reeves, another DC-based guy. I'm sure you're all too familiar with his work, his new institute of boys and men. What do you make of his argument? And is it core to man up? I mean, he talks about this crisis of masculinity, especially of young men. He's been joined by Scott Galloway, Jonathan Haidt, many other leading intellectuals who are all arguing the same case. Is your arguments in Man Up the other side of the Reeves-Galloway coin?
I would say it is a part of the same argument. So I use some of their arguments. I don't disagree with them. I do think that we have a loneliness epidemic among men. Men have 3/4 of the death of despair, drug overdoses, suicides, and alcohol-fueled deaths, 40% of college students at this point. And that's declining. I mean, the feminization of higher ed, the loss of traditional male labor markets.
You mean feminization, not culturally, just literally?
Literally, right? Literally meaning,
More
in
women
both.
than men.
It's literally, but also this perception among boys that it's not for them, right? Because it's become something that education is like part of, like you wouldn't become a nurse either, right? So it's not masculine enough, and
instead of that, they'll become assassins.
Right. Let's hope not, but I think that so I don't disagree with them. I think that one of the things I don't like about Haidt's work, for example, or I wish he did more of, I think it's a very adult-centered view of kids' lives.
And a very sort of upper middle class.
Yes, right, exactly. And so I spend a lot of time interviewing and talking to high school and middle school boys and college-age boys and girls and women. And they do feel that, but they're breaking out of it a lot more. And I think it's a little bit too black and white, that depiction of it. However, what I do think and what I do argue in the book is that crisis, if you will, or those conditions in which men live their lives, have created opportunities for scapegoating online. And often that happens with something like a self-help search that a 13-year-old boy might make, which is, how can I get a girlfriend, or how do you get rich, or what's the best way to get a workout, like how can I get fit, right? So fitness, dating, or finance advice in some way often leads them to influencers like Andrew Tate, not just Andrew Tate, but others, who do give them meaningful advice about how to get fitter, and that helps their lives. But then, it comes with terrible scapegoating. He advocates stoning women if they cheat on you, right? And literally exploits women for sale, for profit, and then brags about it. So, I think that there's that kind of thing that is a risk, and understanding why a lonely boy, a boy who is, 25% of men under the age of 30 in the US say they don't have a single friend, right? I mean, why it is that someone like that might end up, I think, down a rabbit hole that leads them to scapegoat women or feminists or Jews, which usually comes quick on the heels, for their problems, I think is where we need to intervene.
Jews as opposed to Black?
It's really interesting. So this dynamic, so you still have racist language, of course, and racist beliefs, but in the scapegoating, which is the conspiracy theories, it's usually feminists in the manosphere. Feminists and women are to blame for taking the opportunities that men should naturally have, and for, they have it too easy, and they're taking away things from men. But because women are deemed not smart enough to do it on their own, Jews are controlling women. So this is this 1-2 conspiracy. So this intersection of anti-Semitism and anti-feminism is quite strong in the manosphere. It's the top conspiracy intersection that we see in the lab. And the racism is still there, but that's like punching down, right? And so you have that you still have these other conspiracies that are controlling. Racism is more like the attitudinal beliefs and still scientific racism, but they're not looped into the conspiracy in the same way.
So that's interesting, given the way in which anti-Semitism has been so politicized on campus by the current president, certainly by what's happening in the Middle East. And of course, part of your study also focuses on Islamic terrorism. Mm-hmm. Are they all connected, or do these things exist in parallel?
Yeah, I mean, they are. I mean, what I argue in the book is that the through line, one of the many through lines here, is misogyny. When you look at in the data on mass shooters in the US, 60% of mass shooters in the US have a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence, for example. That's only the reported cases that are, documented. And then that also doesn't include things like stalking, harassment, rape threats, sexual assault, all the other types of harms that it can be gendered, anti-LGBTQ issues. So it really becomes, as others have said, a UN report and a New York Times study that I cite in the book, virtually everybody, right? It's very hard. It doesn't mean it's everybody, but it's harder to find a mass shooter who doesn't have a history like that than one who does. It's usually not part of the reporting of the stories that come out about the incident because the targets are often someone else. And I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that when you have the Uvalde, Texas elementary school shooter who was making rape threats and kidnapping threats against teen girls online regularly, incubating in this kind of deeply misogynistic spaces, but then targeted an elementary school with his rage, right? So it doesn't get counted as anything that is motivated ideologically by misogyny, but misogyny helps incubate that rage and could have been potentially a warning sign. So if there's a through line, and same thing with Islamist terrorism as well, where you see this in every, in sort of every group, deeply misogynistic and exploitative engagements with women and girls and boys to some extent, as a tactic of terrorism, as a mechanism of territorial control, as a financial and operational aim of the group. So not just coincidentally, but actually exploitatively. And I think that we just haven't, and to be honest, I didn't look at it in my own career. I mean, this is my 7th book. I've written 4 single authored books and done 3 others that were edited or co-authored. And I really didn't attend to this. And so I opened the book with an apology to the field. Like I had that blind spot too. I wasn't seeing it. And I think that's on all of us to take a closer look.
A few years ago, we had Ayaan Hirsi Ali on the show, who, of course, has made a name for herself in terms of her critique of Islam and of the I guess, the in her view, the inevitably misogynistic nature of Islam. Do you address that in Man Up in terms of Islamic terrorism and perhaps Christian terrorism? They seem in some ways to be connected as well. Is it a religious problem? Is it a problem of Islam, or is it unfair, as many people have accused Ali of focusing on Islam itself?
I don't think you can blame Islam itself, and you can't blame Christianity itself. But there are dimensions of fundamentalist Islam and of biblical patriarchy, if you will, that is in some forms of evangelical Christianity that sets up a belief system in which men are naturally dominant, should be entitled to more power as head of households, and women should be submissive, have less power, and in which it's okay to control them, right? And to not allow them to have certain things, including the calls for example, that women shouldn't have the right to vote anymore in this country. That's been coming on the heels of social media things like repeal the 19th. So I think, I think we have to be very careful. And I try very hard not to demonize the religion itself. There are so many millions and millions and billions of people who practice any religion, but there are roots of patriarchal ideas in virtually all organized religion. And so looking at how those get implemented at the extreme fringes and taken as justification, or how those might incubate ideas that can be taken up around as they spread more wildly on social media around what a real man is, what the head of household should look like, those kinds of things. So it's not the religion per se, but there are elements there that can be exploited.
So this book, Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, I think it's your first book for about 5 years. You've done a lot of research. You connect a lot of stuff in it, which I hadn't naturally connected. The attempt to kidnap and execute Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, the mass killings at Virginia Tech, the Pulse nightclub, and the Maryland newsroom. How are these all connected from North America to Norway? And we all know the terrible events in Norway to New Zealand, the equally terrible.
Yeah. I mean, this is where you see this through line of previous forms of gender-based harm, harassment, bigotry, misogyny playing a role. So again, what's striking is that the targets are often not women. And so we are paying more attention to it when it's incel violence, violent misogynist incel, like the yoga studio shooting in Florida, or the sorority shooting in Santa Barbara, or the Toronto van attack.
You might just remind everyone, Cynthia, what incel means.
Incel, yes.
Not everyone will even know what it means.
Incels are so shorthand for involuntarily celibate. It was originally a volunteer-based group of people who came together online to support each other as a community because they were unable to form intimate or sexual relationships with other people. They couldn't date. Basically, they couldn't find someone. They felt rejected by society. But a part of it evolved into a very virulent anti-woman and also anti-certain kind of man, like a macho man. They call them chads, are also targets of their rage because they believe that 20%, they falsely believe, I should say, it's a conspiracy pseudoscience. They believe that 20% of men have access to 80% of the women, and leaving the other 80% of men with, only 20% of the women. And so they're destined to have no intimate relationships.
It's Pareto's old 80-20 rule.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not true. It's pseudoscience. It got repeated in the television show Adolescence this summer and not corrected. So I always try to make sure that people know it's false pseudoscience. But that's the rage. It's against women who won't date them, and it's against the 20% of men who they think, take advantage and steal all the women. So, those are incels, and there have been 50 some deaths across North America over the last several years attributed to incels. And so, but then there's often incel references, like the Parkland High School shooter praised the incel shooter, out loud before he went in and did the attack, but he wasn't targeting only girls and women. So it's never going to get labeled as an incel attack, but clearly he's been incubating in some of those spaces. And so, I'll use an awful phrase here, but the Charleston shooter, and I never name, by the way, the shooters by name, as I think you may know, that I try not to give them the attention they want and the infamy. So I just call them by the city or the place. But the Charleston church shooter,
and that was a racist assassination.
It was. But as he was enacting it, as he was shooting victims, he said, I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women. Right. So that's the kind of thing that I point to as we have overlooked. Right. It was racist and there was a gender dimension to it that we have to understand, that these things are intertwined. The anger, racist anger in this case, was also about his perception of crime, his misperception and false perceptions of crime statistics, which he had Googled and was led to a white supremacist website. And falsely believed that in these crime statistics, but it was also gendered. So that's part of what I'm arguing, is that understanding how gender mobilizes not just misogyny, but other forms of gendered beliefs about the protection of women, about crime statistics, about about reproductive rights and demographic change in the Great Replacement. So really anger at feminism for not allowing women to reproduce, white women to reproduce enough. That comes up all over the Oslo terrorist shooters manifesto, constant derailing and anger against feminists for preventing demographic change, demographic reproduction to happen. So those are gender dimensions, even though you're never going to see that written up as gender. Does that make sense?
It does, although none of this, in a sense, and you know this better than I do, makes sense. I mean, you run the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, which in a sense, let's say, rationalizes these kind of incidents, but certainly attempts to. I mean, when you have a young white fellow walking into an African-American church, mass murdering male and female blacks in the name of some bizarre abstract injustice, which is, of course, as we all know, is entirely untrue. At what point, Cynthia, does the reality of insanity come into this?
Yeah.
I mean, some of these actions are just insane. And how do you incorporate that into your analysis of misogyny and your arguments in man? Because I wouldn't say nothing can ever, of course, justify mass murder in any way, but some of the arguments or explanations are so absurd, they might as well be they might as well be, crimes in the name of Martians or some other bizarre phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of the Charleston shooter, though, he believed it, right? So he quite rationally believed these crime statistics that were fed to him by a white supremacist website, which, by the way, is an algorithmic problem that Google later fixed, right? Like, we should not be, if someone's searching on crime statistics, black on white crime is what he searched for, which is a whole set of reasons about why he believed he had to search for that. He was looking at the Trayvon Martin case that was going on at the time. But you shouldn't get a white supremacist website as your first hit, right? And so that doesn't happen anymore. Like, they're trying to promote more balanced and accurate and fact-based, returns in the searches. Although, who knows what's going to happen now that AI is generating the content for our searches, which is another question. But so, yes, I think mental health plays a role. We do have to, and I do talk about it a little bit, and particularly around the very sensitive and controversial issue of autism as it relates to incels. Because in a self-reported way, violent incels have a higher rate of autism than the population. And they use that also often to explain why they can't have relationships with women. So, so it's very complicated. It's self-reported. There's not a lot.
Yeah, and autism itself is increasingly politically complicated.
Exactly. And so
I mean, even RFK has got involved in this.
I think the entire mental health issue, what's problematic about it is, like, millions and millions of people suffer from various mental health conditions or neurodivergent conditions and do not ever resort to violence. So it's not like it's the cause of the violence, but it can be a complicating factor, certainly in things like receptivity to propaganda. Someone who has, paranoid schizophrenia is going to be potentially more receptive to propaganda and conspiracy theories. And so, it's those kinds of conditions and connections that I think are important. But I also think that it's really important to we do need mental health assessments. We need school counselors and mental health counselors who are more aware of these problems and have therapeutic off-ramps for sure, rather than just security ones. But I think it's this intersection of vulnerabilities, which can include mental health, and the things they run into online, whether that's false information, disinformation, conspiracy theories, propaganda, whatever, that creates this kind of toxic bubble.
Yeah, and I wonder, you can always find stuff online if you always know what you're looking for. You can always find it. Couple more questions, Cynthia. You've been very generous with your time. On this weekend, September 12th, 13th, you're only going to have to switch on CNN or Fox, and everyone will be talking about a crisis of our culture, crisis of violence, verge of civil war, blah, blah, blah. You've been working on this book, on this new misogyny and violence of masculinity in our culture for the last 5 years. So you didn't write it this weekend. To what extent, in historical terms, is this a crisis? If you and I talk again in 2 or 3 years, are things going to get a lot worse? What's your, I know it's sometimes hard when you've just written a book, but if you stand back, where are we historically on this? In your view, does this deserve the T word or the C word, crisis?
I think that we are at we're certainly at we're at the highest moment of political violence since the 1970s, right? So a year ago, after the first assassination attempt on Trump, I remember saying on a media interview that, it was only a matter of time before we got to political assassinations. It was totally expected and still shocking, right? And we've only seen more of them since then. So I do think we're at this moment the same way that we were in the 60s when we saw those. What we haven't seen yet, but which could happen, I think this is a pivotal moment to make sure it doesn't happen, is what happened after Martin Luther King was, when he was assassinated and 100 cities burned, right? I mean, I moved to DC in 1995, and there were still parts of the city that were burned out entirely, abandoned buildings that had burned and never been reconstructed. That had
Who would do the burning, though? Back then it was the African Americans. Would it be young men going on the street and burning down cities because of the assassination of Charlie Kirk?
I think it depends. If it depends on who turns out, but it's this idea of what we're hearing from some portions of the right online. If it turned out to be someone motivated by extreme left ideas, that this is a spark point for civil war. That's the kind of, right? So I think it's not so much that there'd be burning of cities in protest per se, but there could be a spark point to increasingly frequent backlash effects and the kind of tinderbox of response and suppression from the government, as we've heard, right? Of more suppression, more reductions in rights or freedom of speech. So I hope that doesn't happen. I'm a little heartened by the last 24 hours. I think that the rhetoric has come down a bit, from what we've seen. Not, as I said in the beginning of the interview, not from everyone, but it's been more bipartisan than I anticipated. I do think it was a shock to see a 31-year-old get assassinated, regardless of his views. And I do think that sent a little bit of a shockwave. Whether that changes the social media discourse and what the younger generation is saying about it is a bigger question. I think political leadership has been a little more unified in its response.
Yeah, last year I saw Alex Garland's movie Civil War, which when I watched it, I thought it was slightly absurd, actually. The more I think about it, the sort of the nihilism at the core of that movie, the more it makes sense. Finally,
I agree. Yeah.
You're not just a naysayer. You're someone in the business of trying to work this stuff out. You spoke recently at the United Nations. You just won a large Carnegie Fellowship, $250,000 to research this stuff. You did that earlier this year. What needs to happen that's doable, that's addressable? I mean, some of the stuff you talk about maybe sort of more broadly cultural when it comes to misogyny and second, third waves of feminism. But what can be done in the next couple of years, Cynthia, or even in the next 6 months to try and head off what some people see as a potential civil war of this complete eruption of indiscriminate nihilistic violence?
Yeah, I think there are some really concrete things that are not that hard to do, but that require political will and resources. And so, that may be the harder thing to garner. So one is, is developing community resources and systems where communities, including parents, teachers, faith leaders, mental health counselors, roommates, know where to report and where to get help if there are warning signs. Almost every mass shooter has made a plan, and the majority of them leak some of their intentions to someone. And so, that means that they say something that raises a red flag, where you might know something, right? But people don't want to call the FBI right away for something that just feels like a little bit off about this person. And I'll say that in Germany, where I spent the first 15 years of my career, they have something called mobile advisory centers in 50 sites across the country. And it's a country a quarter of our size that are really set up there to be that resource. So a school counselor here who knows that a kid has an eating disorder or self-harming or an addiction or a sexual assault knows who to call, who to refer the parents to. There are clinics to do that. But you have a kid who's obsessed with mass shooter fandom, like the recent Minnesota shooting or the Highland Park shooting, right? That's obsessed, that's doing, what the Uvalde shooter was doing and making those threats online. Nobody would know where to report that kind of stuff or how to get help therapeutically.
And of course, it wasn't the Minnesota shooting where the parents were actually supplying the...
Exactly, right? And that's happened a lot. I mean, and so you can't always rely only on the parents. Sometimes the parents are contributing, but in the larger circle of adults, and again, it's not only youth, but the larger community of caregivers, if they can be informed, we did a study of parents and caregivers, 1,500 of them, who did an intervention from us on recognizing warning signs and being better equipped and more confident to intervene. And we found that of 1,500 parents, we studied them for a year after the intervention. Within 3 months, 6% of them, which was 75 people, said that they used what they learned to now directly intervene with a young person in some way who they now understood was exposed to harmful content online that might lead them down a pathway to violence. I think that's an incredible statistic, right? Now, what happened with those 6%? We don't know. We didn't have the funding to keep continuing. Where did they go to get help? But it was 75 out of 1,500, 6%. So if you take that number up and you think there's a lot of families out there and a lot of kids out there and young people who are incubating in dangerous and desensitizing and dehumanizing spaces online. And if we can get resources to communities to kind of know how they can respond, that's one.
And don't buy your kids guns, probably not.
Yeah, ideally, right. I mean, there's also the gun control issue. And I will say there's some tech accountability, which I'm not hugely optimistic about, but I think the way that algorithms deliver content to kids, the way that recommended and promoted content comes across their feeds and all of our feeds, so that you're not just looking at things you've subscribed to. I mean, we've seen this in this recent assassination, that a lot of kids saw that live footage, later recorded, right? Saw the footage of the assassination. And what does that do to kids? It was very violent. We know that kids who accidentally saw beheading videos of ISIS, some of them had PTSD, right? It's really not good to have kids run into violent content like that. And so how is it possible that tech companies can't get it off, right, of the screens is really kind of stunning. So I think there's tech sector accountability. I think there's community resource things to do. And I think there's things to do around, just listening to kids much more. And I have a podcast coming out next week on Man Up that is called Man Up. And I talk to teens in it. And one of the questions I ask them is, what do you think parents should know about your online lives? And to me, that was the most fascinating part of all the interviews. And they actually know a lot about what they want to be safer online, but they're also addicted to the screens. And so, thinking about that tension and listening to kids and not just formulating policies based on, adults' perception of them, but seeing what kids think, I think is a good place to start.
And finally, given the focus of your book, which is about the crisis of masculinity or its relationship to violence, can we have feminism, third, fourth, fifth wave, whatever you want to call it, which can empower men and not just, the liberal upper middle class men in New York City or Washington or San Francisco? ordinary middle-class American men, white men, can they feel empowered by strong women?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think they can. I mean, I know they can, right? Based on, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is like, I've been surrounded by men my whole life. I lived in a house of 10 guys. I was on a cycling team with 50 men and 3 women. You know, my 2 best friends from high school are men. I could never have written a book like this. I mean, I've been with my husband 30 years, right? If I have a brother, like if I didn't have men around me who embody a totally, and I've always, I have kids, right? So, which I don't usually talk about publicly, but yes, I have kids and I'm a mom, and, you know, so I'm raising kids, and, you know, so trying to think, you know, I've been in these worlds my whole life and have a huge range of you know, of different ways of seeing different ways of men embody different ways of being. I will say that, like, I was in a high school in March, and a boy came up to me afterward and said, you know, and I've interviewed boys and men my whole life. That's what I did for my research for many years on the fringes of violent movements. And he said, you know, after all the interviews you've done with boys and men, what do you think that people don't know that you've learned? And, you know, I talked to him about it. And then I said, actually, I want to ask you, what do you think people don't know about what it's like to be a boy or a man in the US? And he said right away, I don't think people understand what it's like to suddenly realize the world sees you as dangerous. And then a girl right next to him said, well, I don't think boys understand what it's like to suddenly realize you're a sexual object. And so, and I said, actually, I think the two of you should be having this conversation together, right? It was a really profound moment where I realized, like, they really understand how their lives as they're getting older are being shaped by gender and the way the world perceives them. And they want places to talk about it. And that's where I think both changing conceptions of masculinity play a role of this, but also how, you know, how people and kids interact with each other and understand the pressures or the constraints that it is to be a woman or a man as you're growing up, and how they can then change that. Because I thought that was just one of the most profound moments, you know, of a school conversation I've ever had. They were really vulnerable and open, and they know that they want something different.
In other words, we should all man up. Men, women, old, young, whites, blacks. Everyone needs to man up, according to Cynthia Miller-Idriss, the author of The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. It's not the ideal weekend to talk about it, but it's a most important book, most important conversation. As always, Cynthia.
Thanks,
wonderful
Andrew.
to have you on the show, and I hope the next book won't take 5 years. We'll have to
Thank
get you
you.
back.
Yes, I'll